Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan, also known as the Medieval Genie, and today we're going to be talking about defending yourself properly with a sword. Now, when I'm talking about this, of course, firstly I know that we're in a modern period, I don't need the comments reminding me, so this is a hobby. Anyway, that aside, when we're talking about defending yourself with a sword, I should mention that, of course, today I have a one-handed sword and a shield, but the stuff I'm going to talk about applies to sword with a shield, without a shield, and also not just between one hand but also in two hands. These are more universal concepts. I'm going to use a shield specifically to help demonstrate and illustrate this whole idea a bit more easily for everyone, and then I'll ditch the shield later on to show specifics when you're using a sword on its own. So anyway, to get started, we need to look at something that's permeated itself throughout society, this whole misconception, and just destroy it completely. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about the separation and segregation between the offense and the defense. And they're considered so separately and so apart that you'd almost think they were things happening at a different time of day, even though, of course, they're a very joined action. So, with regards to that, when we're looking at the iconic sorts of representations of offense and defense, of course you have the sword representing offense and the shield representing defense. However, when you're actually using these items, they are, of course, supposed to be used together. And even if you're doing the defending with a sword on its own, again, you should not be considering the defense, like parrying and blocking with a sword or deflecting, separately to when you're attacking with cuts and thrusts and your pommel strikes and all that kind of stuff. You're supposed to marry it all up together. So we'll have a look at a really simple example, like I said, that I'll illustrate with a sword and a shield. A little side note, this one-handed sword is one that I made. It's a little Sparta-like blade in my forge. Anyway, so with the attack that could happen, here's just one example. Let's say we're in whatever starting position, and then the opponent's coming in, and then he's going to perhaps attack horizontally from his right, which is coming in on my left, towards my head. Simple stuff. Now I need to think of a way to counter it. Now, if we didn't marry it up together, and we're thinking way too much in block, attack, and it's all this very, like I said, separated action, what might just happen is the person swings at my head, I put the shield in away, and that's that. Okay, we reset. And then they attack again. I block. I reset. And this is not getting me anywhere. As the defender, I am not defending myself properly, especially if it's a committed opponent who's going to not just give me some basic, okay, I'm going to do this, and then we'll relax, and then I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to relax. Of course, that's not how a fight pans out. Whether it's some sort of sparring, whether it's a duel, or whether it's something more battle-like, it's not realistic, and it's not, as we call, martially viable. It's crap. So, to get this amateur idea out of our heads, we'll look at the same example again. So my opponent is going to do that same cut to my head. And what I instead do is this. I start here, he or she attacks, and I overextended myself a bit there, but here you see, I'll demonstrate it again. They attack, and I defend. Notice that this is something that in historical European martial arts we call a single time defense. Now, when they're talking about a single time defense, this is where the block or parry or whatever to stop yourself getting hurt happens at the same time as you attack the opponent. Like I said, I'll show later on how this is done without a shield. It's more complicated, but it is still possible. Excuse me. But regardless, what you're doing is you're not only blocking and stopping that attack from hurting you, but you're using the opening to exploit it for your own offense. So in that situation that I've showed you, I've blocked the attack to my head, and I've launched basically another attack to the head instead. But this can pan out in many ways. We could, for example, be at a further distance, so then they attack towards my head, I perhaps am stepping back, so maybe I can't reach their head. I'll cut at their forearm and then retract. There are all sorts of ways in which this can pan out, but the concept remains the same regardless. So what we're doing here is we're helping to get rid of this nebulous range of possibilities and condensing it into one action. What I mean by that is, if we're in our ready position, now I've already done videos about stances and postures and positions and all of that, but it doesn't matter. Whatever starting position you wish to be in, with whatever weapon set you're using, you are then starting out of distance, so you can't actually do anything to each other until you get into range, unless you use a projectile weapon. And then eventually you get into distance, and then at this point pretty much anything could happen. There are a lot of options and a lot of possibilities, which is really difficult, because if you don't know what's going to happen, how are you going to plan your attack to happen properly without them stopping you or hitting you at the same time? How are you going to defend an attack when you don't even know what the attack is, where it's coming from, the intensity, all of these factors? It's completely mind-blowing. To be able to calculate and approximate everything that could possibly happen all in 1 second is frankly impossible. So instead, if an opponent has started their attack, suddenly it all condenses down into one thing. So we go back to that example again. The opponent attacks horizontally from their right towards my head. This is a known action. As soon as I know that it is a committed action, it's not some sort of feint, some kind of pretend, and they have to commit to delivering that cut to my head, we've now boiled it all down into me doing whatever I like to counter that specific action. So if they're being a bit more quick, whether they're being a bit more hard, I can see the angle, I can see, and everything that I need to do is now known. It's all condensed down. So with that, I see, okay, perhaps they're swinging very hard. I know they're swinging in this sort of area, so I don't need to worry about any of the rest of this until they do another action later on. So now I'm blocking the head from this side, the only thing I need to worry about for my defense, and at the same time, I can launch my strike. This is one of the things about the defense. Think of it less as being just a shield, or being a sword and just blocking forever. Think of it more as control. Indeed, you can even swap out those terms. Instead of thinking yourself as a decent defender or someone who parries, think of yourself as someone who is deliberately controlling your opponent. So as soon as they've launched their attack, you've got that instance where you've got a known action. But even after that, if you've done something more of an emergency parry, you hardly even know what they were doing, and they've just barely managed to block their attack in time. Even then, when they've done something like strike your weapon or strike a shield, there's that moment where they've just been stopped, and it's still a known action. So even if I drop the shield and I switch to a sword on its own, one of my favourite parry riposts with any one-handed or two-handed sword is that I do a parry, which is an upright parry, especially against higher attacks. The person attacks, I then do parry riposte. So what I'm doing is block with the sword, and I've got this line covered, and then after that I can feel I've taken the impact, ideally on this part of the sword where it's going to be less pushed out of the way and more resisted. And then afterwards I don't whirl around and take half a year to show them what I'm doing and give them a chance to react. Cut the crap, here's a straight line, you die. It's not as powerful, but it's nice and quick. Now in that example, I've seen the opponent is doing that attack, so I know it's that specific angle of attack at that particular kind of power. I know I can block it, or even perhaps try to dodge and then cut their arms, some other action like that. Or if it's not a single time defense, like cutting their arm or blocking the shield and cutting their head, I can do it as a two-time defense, which is just simply I do my action to block and then immediately do some sort of counter. Really simple stuff. It doesn't take a genius to recognise that. But you're just doing, in this example, here's my inside parry, the attack, I cut, I get out of there. Really easy stuff. But the thing that makes it so glorious is that because you know that attack's coming in, and you've also had that impact happen, there is a brief moment in which the opponent is stopped. They've had to hit the shield or hit the sword and doing this. Instead of, we're whirling around, you're out in the open. If they swung and there was no sword or shield, there's no block, there's no parry or anything happening, they could still be out in the open, so they're whirling around and doing these carts, thrusts, doing whatever they like, and they're open and they can still move around. Whereas, if they swing and instead it is actually blocked or stopped, there is that brief moment. It can cause something we call a bind, a bit like when swords lock that you see on TV, all of this stuff going on. But even just doing that block, it stops their sword for a brief moment, or non-sword weapon. There's that window where you know their weapon is right there. You're not going to get hit, you're not being hit on the other side, you're not being stabbed, you're not being struck elsewhere, nothing else is happening. Their weapon is right there, where you just blocked it. Yes, this window is an extremely short window, and it can often last less than a second, but it is a window of opportunity nonetheless. There is that moment where everything's all condensed again, there's no more confusing, anything can happen. They're here, right now. What do I do with it? The answer? Whatever the hell I like. So in that example, like I mentioned about the inside parry and the riposte, I think, ding, the weapon's stopped. Oh look, it's a completely open target. Well, I'm not going to give them too long to recover. There you go, I'm out of here. Bye bye. Of course, that's why I say you shouldn't take too long in your riposte. So if I did something like a block, and instead of doing, let's say I do it in more of a sloping parry instead of an upright parry, I should try to go ding ding, that's it, parry riposte, easy stuff. What I don't want to do is try to turn it into too much of an overly long parry riposte or other such of item. You can also do this not just as stopping the weapon, you could also do it as something like a beat. So the opponent's trying to swing in at my head again. I'll just keep using that example so it's easy for you. Swinging at my head, and this time I back the sword away. They're not going to be disarmed, it's not realistic, but they'll temporarily, whoa! I'll hit them, ideally, towards the tip of their sword on the flat, swat it away, and there's that brief moment where they're open. So I go, ha! And in that example, I've just simply, afterwards, I've used the back edge of a two-edged sword to cut at their neck, or head. I could do this with one-edged sword, so cut, and then I'm turning and cutting with the front edge. Whatever I like, or bat, stab, any number of things really. I can even do it in a sort of a moulinet, which is a sort of a rotating type of windmill motion like this. So I could go bat, cut, that sort of thing. But the concept is the same. I've used my defense, which gives me a brief window of an opportunity. I exploit the opportunity, and then I am going away before they get angry and retaliate to me. Fantastic. That is how decent sword fighting is done. Or, if I'm feeling more confident, I could turn it into an opportunity and then keep pressing and keep using my advantage further in. But regardless, that defense is not just a stop the sharp thing from doing the bad thing to me. It is a, look, something specific has just happened. Now I've got opportunities to do something to retaliate. And if we go back to what I mentioned earlier about perhaps the sword or shield is not in the way, there is still opportunity to do something like a single time defense or a two-time defense. So on the ones I've done, I've mentioned this in a previous video, or one of the previous videos, is when I'm up against beginners, I might have the sword out and they're going to try cutting at me, or perhaps try beating the sword aside to follow up. So I'll just simply drop the point, maybe step back if required, and re-engage with something like a thrust or a cut. And what's happening there is there are these targets, perhaps the weapon, perhaps my arms, perhaps something deeper towards my body itself. The target is removed, I attack them in some fashion, and then I get them. So what's happening there is, even if in that situation a sword is not stopped, there is still a brief window in which they've finished swinging and they're briefly, it's only, again, it's for a part of a second, there's a brief window in which they're open. Now it should be mentioned that when you do an active block or parry, when you're stopping them, so they have to start the momentum from the beginning again, you create a larger window of opportunity. You get more time span in which to do whatever you like. Whereas if you're doing something where you evade the attack, you do get an opportunity. There is still a small window, but it is much smaller. I'd say somewhere between a half and 2/3 of the original window. So if we go back to that head cut example, I block, I riposte, I've got more time in which to do my riposte, whereas if they go for that head attack, I dodge, riposte. There's a smaller window, and you should always be aware of that. If you're doing something where you void the attack and you're away from it, in some sort of dodge or deflection or something like that, they can quite easily recover and then try something else. Let's say they've tried cutting my head. Oh, I'm here. Well, then I'm going to cut from this side. So then they're just doing some of this. It's a very brief window, and then you're almost having to treat it like a skipping rope. You know, you've got that timing in there. You've got the attack, attack, the opponent's doing this, this, this. So while this is happening, it's dangerous. While this is happening, it's dangerous. But as you're the defender, there is the brief window. Could be dangerous. You might have an opportunity to attack somewhere like the hands and forearms, but you're doing it riskily. Now it's getting to a point where you need to be out of the way already, but you might have an opportunity to hit areas like the hands and forearms, and then as they're going away, target opens up, and then target is now gone again, and you need to defend yourself. So there's that timing. You've got safe, dangerous, safe, dangerous, safe, dangerous, and it keeps going like that. And as you get more experienced, it's just like learning to skip on a rope. You get that timing understood. And of course, if an opponent's trying different actions, the timing will change, so you will need to get used to that. People who are physically faster and who are more experienced in using a sword or other weapon properly will have a quicker timing to do their action, and then people who are sluggish and less experienced and are trying something more of a walloping, really hard attack, the longer the opening is, the more the delay between their actions. And I did have an experience at, I think it was the May Melee once, which is an event that I go to sometimes, at least before the pandemic. And I was up against this guy, and we were using two-handed swords, and he was pretty much a one-trick pony. Got a lot of people very scared because he's a very well-built guy. And his idea of fighting was to do this. And then again. And then again. So he'd just swing as hard as he could in a diagonal cut from his right, because he's right-handed, diagonally down, basically cutting from my shoulder to my hip, trying to bisect me easily. But of course, because he was putting so much into that, it created a window. So I tried many things. I tried to mix it up so that he didn't notice too quickly, because if I did the same action, then the same action, he might adapt his attack, or he might even realise this isn't working and completely change in terms of adapting his attack. Let's say I'm parrying too much in the same way with this inside parry. I was using a two-handed sword, so it looked more like this. He might notice that, slightly lower his cut, and instead of trying to bisect me in the head and shoulders, I put the sword up, wham! Ah! He strikes me in the fingers, just slightly, a little bit lower in the aim. So this is one of the things about defending. You've got to make sure that you mix it up, because if you're always doing the same thing to the same action, you're eventually going to get caught out. You might perhaps try an action, and they get parried, try, they get parried, And then this time, nope, I'm doing something else. So then what's happened is, you've put your defence in a way, they've only pretended to go here, and then they cut you. Oopsie, not a good idea. So there's a degree of variation you need to do. So like for example I mentioned, you can mix it up with different types of parries. There are things like more upright parries, more sloping parries, trying to beat the sword aside, trying to avoid the attack entirely. Just mix it up a bit. So if we go back to this guy I was fighting with a fight camp, so what would happen is, let's say he tries that really hard swing. So the first time, parry, riposte. I'm doing the same thing with two hands that I mentioned earlier you do with one hand. Here I am in my ready position. I prefer low stances, that's me naturally. Parry, riposte. And then the next exchange, he tries it again. So then he goes, he tries to swing, so I go, so I've gone out, he swings a few inches, short of my head or my torso. I then go in, and I don't even need to travel very far to hit his head. I can stay even quite safely out of distance, so he's almost a foot or two out of range. There's a hand, cut it, because of course a person swinging a sword usually puts their arms forward for reach, which means that there's a distance issue where I've got to be this far in to hit the head, but I only need to be that far in to hit the hands and forearms. Nice juicy targets. And anyone who knows me in sparring knows I'm the hand carver for a reason. Anyway, so then we have, perhaps, he tries that same thing again. He tries to swing, parry, riposte. So now I've changed it up again. I would potentially have tried the beat, but he is very strong and extremely committed to that. So if I try to beat, it'd be more like, shit. He goes through my attempted beat, or perhaps we meet up in something more like a bind. So it's becoming that same parry earlier, and then I've kind of put so much force into that swing that my riposte that I was doing earlier happens, but it's slower. Which means he might attack a second time and hit me. I don't want to be hit, especially by a guy who's that angry, frankly, and that big. No thanks. So there'd be another instance where we'll go, Whoa! So in this situation, maybe I'm tempting him a bit with this, what's called posta breve, short point, and just got the sword up. It's there, maybe to get beaten aside, or he goes past and just hits me in the head anyway. Nope. Thrust. Easy stuff. So again, I'm showing you a specific example, but it's just to demonstrate the general concept. You're looking at voiding an attack that happens, you're looking at parrying an attack that happens, and then if we're looking at something more of a single time defense, I was not as experienced back then, so I wouldn't have been confident to do a single time defense, especially again because he was a bit terrifying. But I could have gone into this, which is called the window guard, same up here from Fiore stuff, very similar to the German ox. And then he could have gone, and then I'm planning to catch him. This sword doesn't have quillons, but you can imagine it just, there, a cross guard. And then while I'm blocking him, I'm then driving the sword forward. This is an example, again, of a single time defense. So instead of it being block, attack, if it goes perfectly, it can be both. He gets caught on a cross, I'm already driving in a thrust, the defense and the attack happens simultaneously. And another example of a single time defense, which I think I managed against him as well, is rather than this skipping rope idea where he's done his action, I avoided the attack and then do the action, is actually I see him go trying to swing at me. Now if you look at me right now, notice what's happening with my body. I've got here, I'm turning, well he actually would be more like this, putting the whole body into it, swing, and you'll notice, just like my favourite target, the hands and forearms extend in front of the body. So what happens is, he's going, and in the meantime, I'm aiming for his hands. Which again, it's something you should bear in mind with parrying and defending, as well as your ripostes, the distance of it all. So if he's swinging, trying to aim for somewhere like my head and my torso, he's got this distance, whereas I can be closer. So we're too far away, and he's maybe ending up about here, but my arms are out of the way, so I'm not getting struck in the arms. His arms are forward, so what's happening is he's aiming for somewhere like my head, and that's another reason why I like to keep my arms low, by the way. It's part of the structure. This is kind of digressing, but it's part of defence, or say it's part of the video. It's a good way to defend. I keep my arms low because when people strike for high targets, if I've got my hands high in one of these types of positions, what could happen is they aim for my head or shoulders and they cut my forearms or my elbows while I'm trying to do something. I don't like that. So I keep my arms low, and this is still a stance where I can get ready for a defence, perhaps an upright parry, voiding attack, sloping parry, all of those sorts of things. And while he's doing that, I'm going to wear my voice out doing that, but he's doing that, cut, and it happens at the same time. It's a single time defence because he is swinging, I am swinging, so he is putting all of his arms and his body forward and exposing himself, and I'm starting from a low position, and because he's aiming up around here, when I strike, my arms are not getting hit because yes, they punch forwards, but his aim is up here. So in the meantime, if I was going around here, we'd hit each other. Because my arms are positioned here, he is swinging in this area, he misses and swings at the air, whereas my sword hits him in those forearms and the hands, whichever. Usually, I think in that instance I caught him on the actual fingers, hitting around the knuckle or somewhere like that. But yeah, that's an example of a single time defense that you use with a sword on its own. I mentioned earlier that if you're using a shield like this, it's much easier because you've got two objects. It also becomes very easy if you're using two weapons, a sword and a hatchet, or a sword and another sword, or even a sword and dagger like you see in some actual sort of styles that are in treatises, like rapier and dagger is one that's known, which is kind of, you're in positions like this. So your second weapon defends and your first weapon attacks. It's just something that you can do. The second object, be it a shield or another weapon, makes a single time defense specifically much more easier. And it also helps with defending sides. I find if I'm using a shield, for example, I can use the shield to parry in any direction I like. And I've seen, or at least I've been taught, one with Scottish broadsword where I can parry, let's say someone's cutting from their left towards my right. Of course, my shield is naturally in my left hand around my left. I can cross it over, and then there's a thrust that happens around from behind the shield, so weapon gets blocked, I perform the attack, kind of thing. This is possible, but I personally find that if someone attacks me from my sword side, I parry using the sword itself. Now there are options that open up from there. I could parry and then strike at their arm. I can try to control and manipulate them using the shield. I could perhaps strike towards them with the shield and distract their vision, maybe even get an actual punch action with the edge of the shield itself. Or just simply, I parry with the sword, and I'm doing it, treating it almost as though I don't have a shield. So I'm doing parry riposte. But of course, my shield is still here. I never remove my shield, and that's something to bear in mind. You shouldn't stop yourself from being able to defend. What happens is I parry with the sword, and it's either parry riposte, so then they've been stopped on this side, I'm attacking as I see fit, or if it's something more like a feint, again, I'm ready because parry, they actually were going, instead of going and committing, they're going 1, 2 as a feint, I pretend. So I've gone parry, parry, I don't care, I'm killing you. Or, sorry, I'm doing that wrongly. I should have mentioned, like I said earlier, marrying up the attack and defence. Let's try that once more. So it goes parry, counter. Oh, notice I'm doing that thing I mentioned earlier where I'm marrying up the attack and the defence. So there's less of a window of opportunity for the opponent. and you're more within the window of opportunity during what your opponent's doing. So instead of parry with an object, parry with an object, separately attack, which is a more clumsy method of fighting. Parry the attack, parry and attack in one go. Simultaneous. Lovely stuff. So yeah, I've been whittering on about defending, but hopefully that should get your head swimming with new ideas and less of this idea of I block, I attack, I block, I attack, and more like parry riposte or parry and riposte, all of that done fluidly, and it really should flow. I know when you're looking at some martial arts, especially your more Asian martial arts, they talk about that you need to flow and move like water and all of this, and it looks so pretentious, but actually, apart from the weird poses on, you know, kung fu movies, the actual concepts are correct. You should keep these things moving. You should not end up being static and rigid, because that is a bad way to use your sword. You should not be thinking parry. You should be thinking parry riposte. Do I need to close in? Parry now, I'm really close, thanks, I'll stab your face. Maybe even parry, oh I'm so close, I'm taking your sword, thank you. And then I'm free to do what I like. Maybe you're thinking, I'll go back while I'm defending. Parry, well, maybe even not parry, I'm far enough away. Haha, your hands are still forward. All of this going on. So always incorporate defence into your distance. This is one of Fiore's qualities, the links. We're looking at things like your judgment, which is talking about your distance. You know, can I hit you, the camera, yet? No. Can I hit you? Now I can, sort of thing. And timing being that stuff mentioned earlier, like the skipping rope. When can you attack? When should you defend? What timing is this stuff taking, and how is this back and forth happening? That sort of stuff. I'll talk more about that in another video. So until next time, so I'm not overloading you with too much information at once, I will see you in the next video. Toodaloo.